Hello. So today I'm going to be reading the first book of the Ranger's Apprentice series, The Ruins of Gorlan, by John Flanagan. It's the first of a really good series. I really like them. And it was published by Puffin Books. And the blurb on the back reads, "The Rangers, with their shadowy ways, have always made him nervous. And now 15-year-old Will has been chosen as a Ranger's apprentice. But what he doesn't yet realize is that the Rangers are protectors of the kingdom who will fight the battles before the battles reach the people. And there's a large battle brewing. The exiled Morgorath, Lord of the Mountains of Rain and Night, is gathering his forces for an attack on the kingdom. This time he will not be denied." So, the first chapter, we'll find it. Okay, so the first chapter. "Try to eat something, Will. Tomorrow's a big day after all." Jenny, blonde, pretty and cheerful, gestured toward Will's barely touched plate and smiled encouragingly at him. Will made an attempt to return the smile, but it was a dismal failure. He picked at the plate before him, piled high with his favorite foods. Tonight his stomach knotted tight with tension and anticipation. He could hardly bring himself to swallow a bite. Tomorrow would be a big day, he knew. He knew it all too well. In fact, tomorrow would be the biggest day of his life. Because tomorrow was a choosing day, and it would determine how he spent the rest of his life. "Nerves, I'd imagine," said George, setting down his loaded fork and seizing the lapels off his jacket in a judicious manner. He was a thin, gangly, and studious boy, fascinated by rules and regulations, and with a penchant for examining and debating both sides of any question, sometimes at great length. Dreadful thing, nervousness can just freeze you up, so you can't think, can't eat, and can't speak. "I'm not nervous," Will said quickly, noticing that Horace had looked up, ready to form a sarcastic comment. George nodded several times, considering Will's statement. "On the other hand," he added, "a little nervousness can actually improve performance. It can heighten your perceptions and sharpen your reactions. So the fact that you are worried, if in fact you are, is not necessarily something to be worried about, of itself, so to speak." In spite of himself, a wry smile touched Will's mouth. George would be a natural in the legal profession, he thought. He would almost certainly be the scribe master's choice. On the following morning, perhaps, Will thought. That was at heart of his own problem. He was the only one of the ward mates who had any fears about the choosing that would take place within 12 hours. He ought to be nervous, Horace scoffed. After all, which craft master is going to want him as an apprentice? "I'm sure we're all nervous," Alas said. She directed one of her rare smiles at Will. "We'd be stupid not to be." "Well, I'm not," Horace said, then reddened as Alas raised one eyebrow, and Jenny giggled. It was typical of Alas, Will thought. He knew that the tall, graceful girl had already been promised a place in an apprentice by Lady Pauline, head of Castle's Redmont diplomatic services. Her pretense that she was nervous about the following day, and her tact in refraining from pointing out that Horace's gaffe showed that she was already a diplomat of some skill. Jenny, of course, would gravitate immediately toward the castle kitchens, domain of Master Chubb, Redmont head chef. He was a man renowned throughout the kingdom for the banquets served in the castle's massive dining hall. Jenny loved food and cooking, and her easygoing nature and unfailing good humor would make her an invaluable staff member in the turmoil of the castle kitchens. Battle school would be Horace's choice. Will glanced at his ward mate, now hungrily tucking into the roast turkey, ham, and potatoes that he had heaped onto his plate. Horace was big for his age and a natural athlete. The chances he would be refused were virtually non-existent. Horace was exactly the type of recruit that Sir Rodney looked for in his warrior apprentices, strong, athletic, fit. And though Will a trifle sourly, not too bright. And thought Will a trifle sourly, not too bright. Battle school was a path to knighthood for boys like Horace, born commoners with the physical abilities to serve as knights of the kingdom, which left Will. What choice would he be? More importantly, as Horace had pointed out now, what craftmaster would accept him as an apprentice? For choosing day was the pivotal point in the life of the castle wards. There were orphan children raised by the generosity of Baron Arald, the Lord of Redmont Fife. For the most part, their parents had died in services of the fief, and the Baron saw it as his responsibility to take care and raise the children of his former subjects, and to give them an opportunity to improve their station of life wherever possible. Choosing day provided that opportunity. Each year, castle wards turning 15 could apply to be apprenticed to the masters of the various crafts that served the castle and its people. Ordinarily, craft apprentices were selected by dint of their parents' occupations or influence with the craft masters. The castle wards usually had no such influence, and this was their chance to win a future for themselves. Those wards who weren't chosen, or for whom no openings could be found, would be assigned to farming families in the nearby village, providing farm labor to raise crops and animals that fed the castle's inhabitants. It was rare for this to happen. Will knew the Baron and his craftmasters usually went out of their way to fit the wards into one craft or another, but it could happen, and it was a fate he feared more than anything. Horace caught his eye now and gave him a smug smile. Still planning on applying for battle school, Will? He asked, through a mouthful of turkey and potatoes. Better eat something, then you'll need to build yourself up a little. He snorted with laughter, and Will glowered at him. A few weeks previously, Horace had overheard Will confiding to a lass that he desperately wanted to be selected for battle school, and he had made Will's life misery ever since, pointing out on every possible occasion that Will's slight build was totally unsuited for the rigors of battle school training. The fact that Horace was probably right only made matters worse. Where Horace was tall and muscular, Will was small and wiry. He was agile and fast and surprisingly strong, but he simply didn't have the size that he knew was required for battle school apprentices. He hoped against hope for the past few years that he would have what people called his growing spurt before the choosing day came around. But it never happened, and now the day was nearly here. As Will said nothing, Horace sensed that he had scored a verbal hit. This was a rarity in their turbulent relationship. Over the past few years, he and Horace had clashed repeatedly. Being the stronger of the two, Horace usually got the better of Will, although very occasionally Will's speed and agility allowed him to get in a surprise kick or a punch and then escape before Horace could catch him. But while Horace generally had the best of their physical clashes, it was unusual for him to win any of their verbal encounters. Will's wit was as agile as the rest of him, and he almost always managed to have the last word. In fact, it was his tendency that often led to trouble between them. Will was yet to learn that having the last word was not always a good idea. Horace decided now to press it as an advantage. You need muscles to get into battle school, Will. Real muscles. He glanced around at the others to see if anyone at the table disagreed. The other wards uncomfortable at the growing tension between the two boys, concentrated on their plates, particularly between the ears, Will replied, and unfortunately, Jenny couldn't refrain from giggling. Horace's face flushed, and he started to rise from his seat, but Will was quicker and was already out the door before Horace could disentangle himself from his chair. He contented himself with hurling a final insult at his retreating ward mate. That's right, run away, Will, no name. You're a no name, and nobody will want you as apprentice. In the anteroom outside, Will heard the parting sally and felt blood flush to his cheeks. It was the taunt he hated most, although he tried never to let Horace know that, sensing he would provide the bigger boy with a weapon if he did. The truth was, nobody knew Will's second name. Nobody knew who his parents had been, unlike his year mates who had lived in the Fife before their parents had died and whose family's history were unknown. Will had appeared virtually out of nowhere as a newborn baby. He'd been found wrapped in a small blanket and placed in a basket on the steps of the ward building 15 years ago. A note had been attached to the blanket, reading simply, "His mother died in childbirth. His father died a hero. Please care for him. His name is Will." That year, there had been only one other ward. Alas's father was a cavalry lieutenant who had died in battle at Hacklem Heath when Morgoth's Wargle army had been defeated and driven back into the mountains. Alas's mother, devastated by her loss, succumbed to a fever some weeks after giving birth. So there was plenty of room in the ward for the unknown child, and Baron Errol was at heart a kindly man. Even though the circumstances were unusual, he had given permission for Will to be accepted as a ward of Castle Redmont. It seemed logical to assume that if the note were true, Will's father had died in the war against Morgoth, and since Baron Errol had taken a leading part in the ward, he felt duty-bound to honor the unknown father's sacrifice. So Will had become a Redmont ward, raised and educated by the Baron's generosity. As time passed, the others had gradually joined him, and alas, until there were 5 in their year group. But while others had memories of their parents, or in Alas's case, people who had known them, and who could tell her about them, Will knew nothing of his past. That was why he had invented the story that had sustained him throughout childhood of the ward, and as the years passed, he added detail and color to the story. He eventually came to believe it himself. His father, he knew, had died a hero's death, so it made sense to create a picture of him as a hero, a knight warrior in full armor, fighting against Wargle hordes, cutting them down left and right, until eventually he was overcome by sheer weight of numbers. Will had pictured a tall figure so often in his mind, seeing every detail of his armor and his equipment, but never being able to visualize his face. As a warrior, his father would expect him to follow in his footsteps. That was why selection for battle school was so important to Will, and that was why the more unlikely it became that he would be selected, the more desperately he clung to the hope that he might. He exited from the ward building into the darkened castle yard. The sun was long down, and the torches placed every 20 meters or so on the castle walls shed a flickering, uneven light. He hesitated a moment. He would not return to the ward and face Horace's continued taunts. So he would only lead another fight between them, a fight that Will knew he would probably lose. George would probably try to analyze the situation for him, looking at both sides of the question and thoroughly confusing the issue. Alas and Jenny might try to comfort him. He knew Alas particularly, since they had grown up together. But at that moment he didn't want their sympathy, and he couldn't face Horace's taunts, so he headed for the one place where he knew he could find solitude. The huge fig tree growing close by the castle's central tower had often afforded him a haven. Heights held no fear to Will, and he climbed smoothly into the tree, continuing long after another might have stopped, until he was in the lighter branches at the very top, branches that swayed and dipped under his weight. In the past, he had often escaped Horace from up here. The bigger boy couldn't match Will's speed in the tree, and he was unwilling to follow as high as this. Will found a convenient fork and wedged himself in it. his body giving slightly to the movement of the tree as the branches swayed in the evening breeze. Below, the foreshortened figures of the watch made their rounds of the castle yard. He heard the door of the ward building open, and glancing down, he saw a lass emerge, looking around the yard for him in vain. The tall girl hesitated a few moments, then, seeming to shrug, turned back inside. In the elongated rectangle of light that the open door threw across the yard was cut off as she closed the door softly behind her. Strange, he thought, how seldom people tend to look up. There was a rustle with soft feathers as a barn owl landed on the next branch, its head swiveling, its huge eyes catching every last ray of the faint light. It studied him without concern, seeming to know it had nothing to fear of him. It was a hunter, a silent flyer, a ruler of the night. "At least you know who you are," he said softly to the bird. It swiveled its head again and then launched itself into the darkness, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Gradually he sat there. The lights in the castle windows went out one by one. The torches burnt down to smoldering husks and were replaced at midnight by the change of watch. Eventually, there was only one light left burning that he knew was the Baron's study, where the Lord of Redmont was still presumably at work, poring over reports and papers. The study was virtually level with Will's position in the tree, and he could see the burly figure of the Baron seated at his desk. Finally, Baron Earl rose, stretched, and leaned forward to extinguish the lamp as he left the room, heading for his sleeping quarters on the floor above. Now the castle was all asleep, except for the guards on the walls who kept constant watch. In less than 9 hours, Will realized he would face choosing. Silently, miserably, fearing the worst, he climbed down from the tree and made his way to his bed in the darkened boys' dormitory in the ward. That is the first chapter of Ranger's Apprentice, Ruins of Gorlan. I hope you liked it.